Okay, everyone, let's say we were looking at weather records. And particularly, we were looking at how many inches it rained on the given day of some month in a town. All right? So how many inches did it rain on a given day of, let's say, I don't know, February 1974 in the town of Upper Darby? Okay? So that's a functional relationship. And what would be the input in this function? What depends on what? The input in this function would be the date, right? And the output in this function would be the inches of rain. Inches of rain. All right, so in this scenario, in this function, there are two variables, right? There's the variable of our input, the date of the month, and there's the variable of our output, which is the inches of rain. So this is as good a time as any to introduce us to some new vocabulary words. The input, we call that the independent variable. Independent variable, that's the variable of your input. And the output, we call those values the dependent variables. The output, that is the dependent variable, which should make sense, right? Because as we've talked about, the output is what depends on the input, right? The input causes the output, so the output is dependent on the input. So the input is the independent variable, the output is the dependent variable. Okay, so let's take a look at this data table here. I've made up a data table to summarize some of the relationships between the dates of this month and the amount of, or rather the inches of rain that fell in this month. So if we look here, date the first of the month, on that day there was 1 inch of rain. The second of the month there was 1.3 inches of rain. The third of the month, 0 inches of rain. The fourth of the month, also 0 inches of rain, and so on and so forth, right? So let's look here. On the third of the month, there was 0 inches of rain, so an input of 3 produced an output of 0. And on the fourth of the month, there was also 0 inches of rain, so an input of 4 also produced an output of 0. And that is allowed. But I'll tell you what isn't allowed, and here we're going to write down one of the most important rules of functions. One of the most important rules of functions. Any individual input must have only one output. Any individual input must have only one output. It's not the case that any individual output must have only one input, right? Because let's go back to the table we're looking at. Doesn't it make sense that it can rain 0 inches on multiple days of the week, right? You can have the output 0 associated with multiple inputs. It might rain 0 days the third day of the week, the fourth day of the week. I'm sorry, it might rain 0 inches the first day of the week, the fourth day of the week, and even beyond. It might rain 0 inches the 18th day of the week, the 27th day of the week. It might rain 0 inches each 31 days of the week, right? So it makes sense that that an output can have multiple inputs, right? But it can't make sense that an individual input has multiple outputs. Because would it make sense to say, hypothetically, that on the first day there was 1 inch of rain, but also 1.3 inches of rain? Would that make sense to say? No, we need an answer, right? The whole point of a function is to get an answer from a input, right? We want to know how many inches of rain were there on the first of the month. And there can't be 2 correct answers to that question, right? There can only possibly be one answer to that question. So that's why we have this very important rule that's part of what defines what a function is. Any individual input must have only one output. Okay, let's think of another relationship that is a functional relationship. And let's think of this. Let's say that you are going to a brick and mortar school. So the relationship between where you catch the bus and how long it takes you to get to school is a function, right? Well, what depends on what? What would be our input here? In this case, our input would be the bus stop, right? Our input would be the bus stop. If I can spell correctly today, our input would be the bus stop. And what would our output be? Our output would be the time it takes to get to school, right? Hopefully that makes sense. The input will be your bus stop, and the output will be the time it takes to get to school. That's because the time it takes to get to school depends on what the input is, right? It depends on your bus stop. So in this case, our independent variable is the stop, and our dependent variable is the time it takes to get to school. So let's imagine that stop 1 took, if you were at stop 1, let's say it's going to take you 30 minutes to get to school, okay? So an input of 1 for bus stop 1 produces an output of 30 for 30 minutes. Let's say stop 2 takes, let's say, 18 minutes to get to school, all right? So in this function, an input of 2 for bus stop number 2 produces an output of 18 for the fact that it takes 18 minutes to get to school from bus stop 2. Let's say stop 3. Let's say at stop 3 it takes you, let's say, also 30 minutes. Let's say stop 3 also takes you 30 minutes. So an input of 3 into this function representing stop 3 would give you an output of 30 representing 30 minutes. And let's say stop 4 took 13 minutes. Let's say stop 4 took 13 minutes to get to school. So in this function, an input of 4 to represent stop 4 would produce an output of 13 to represent 13 minutes, okay? And let's take a look at stop 3 and stop 1 for a minute. Now remember what our rule is. Our rule is that an individual input can only have one output, but different inputs can produce the same output. It should make sense that if you're going to the same place, it might take you the same amount of time to get there, even if you start from different locations, right? Because maybe, say, for example, different bus stops can be the same distance from somewhere, but in opposite directions, right? So you're allowed to say that the input of 1 gives you the output of 30, and also the input of 3 gives you the output of 30. That makes sense, right? Because the point of this function is to be able to have an answer for the question. How long does it take you to get to school from any given bus stop? It's important that we have one answer. Now, different bus stops can result in the same answer. That's okay. But we wouldn't be able to say, for example, bus stop 1 takes you both 30 minutes and 21 minutes. That wouldn't make sense, right? Because that wouldn't be an answer. We can't be asked, how long does it take you to get to school from bus stop 1? And we can't say in response, 30 minutes and 21 minutes, right? That's, again, why you're not allowed to have multiple outputs for one input.